Hello, Burnsville High School. We are going to be talking neutrality to involvement today. So we've talked about a number of the causes that drove us into World War II, or that led to World War II in general. And we watched a video that talked about how the Nazis had invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia, in addition to the Japanese moving into Manchuria. So globally, there are things happening in the world that the United States is not necessarily involved with yet, hence the term neutrality to involvement. And this is going out of Chapter 24, Section 4. The beginning parts of Chapter 24 talk about Section 1 is the dictators, which we're going to touch base on a little bit in class. Section 2 talks about the war in Europe, which we've talked about a little bit. The Holocaust we're going to cover later, and then it's this section about how, now that all these things are developing in Europe, how we move into war. So the things that we're going to cover just real briefly today to describe the response of the United States to the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939. So how did we respond? What did we do? Again, 1939 is when the Nazis invaded Poland. Secondly, to show how Roosevelt assisted the Allies without declaring war, so how we kind of maintained that neutrality. And then eventually to summarize the events that brought the United States into armed conflict with Germany. So all of these stem from Chapter 24, Section 4. Okay, so that's what we're doing today. How exciting. As we look at the beginning of what we started to do. So that first objective of our response to the United States to the outbreak of war. This section talks about the Neutrality Act, and the Neutrality Act was the idea that we were going to pass a law that would keep us able to help our allies, but not directly involved in the war. So we had a Neutrality Act set up, and we revised it to include a cash and carry policy. So that means that nations would buy American arms, weapons, and military goods as long as they paid cash and carried them home in their own ships. So we weren't shipping to different countries because we didn't want to risk our ship security. And we didn't want to have loans be taken out because, we couldn't predict how everyone would come out after the end of this war. So this was one of those things that we used to react to how things were happening globally in World War I initially. We went through this policy, and the whole purpose was to keep us out of the war again, but still be able to help our allies. Like, we didn't want to get our ships involved. We didn't want to get our people involved, run the risk of them being sunk in the ocean. We didn't want to have any interruption to delivery. But by the summer of 1940, it looked like it was too little too late because France had already fallen and Great Britain was under siege. So it was too bad, and that didn't really work to our favor. And as this is also happening, in September of 1940, we have our three major powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, signed the Tripartite Pact. So what this said was it was a mutual defense pact. So if anybody declared war on Japan, all three countries would fight. If anyone declared war on Italy, all three countries would fight on their behalf. So they went into this treaty, and they saw it as the best way to keep us out of war. So they wanted to keep the United States out, and any nation that was attacked would be helped by the other two. And it was eventually what came to be our worst nightmare, because then we'd be fighting on different continents, different oceans, different tactics in terms of the way they approach military. So it just was really a really bad situation. So how did we react to this? We increased our military spending and passed the draft. So we kind of felt like something was coming. Something was coming. But at the same time, FDR said, hey, I really want to, keep us out of war. I want to keep us as neutral as we can, as long as possible. And then he was elected again for the third time. So he, as the Republican, ran for as a Democrat, ran for president, and it was unprecedented because nobody had done that, since Washington. Washington said 2 terms, it's good. we should move on. There wasn't any law at the time that said you couldn't run 3 times. Now there is. But at the time there wasn't. And so he ran again, and his Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, agreed with Roosevelt's policy of aiding Great Britain and supported a lot of the same things that Roosevelt did. He just happened to be a Republican. And so since the race was so, two candidates were so similar, people fell back and kind of voted for the one they knew the best. And that was Roosevelt. So he won in 1940, and kind of continued on with his plan. He had another, he was very famous for his fireside chats. And what he would do is put out a radio program where he would sit by the fireside, and everyone who was listening would sit by their fireplace and listen to what he had to say about life as president. But he said that, eventually we couldn't negotiate a peace with Hitler, so we had to get involved. And the quote that he gives in the book is that no man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it. So we had to eventually get involved. We had to defeat the Axis threat, and we had to be the great arsenal of democracy. Which hopefully you're all giggling at right now because, well, no, not yet, because we're not watching this in class. Anyways, we're going to do an activity with the great arsenal of democracy tomorrow. So what he did, and that should say arsenal of, not arsenal for democracy, my bad. But what he did is he took the Lend-Lease Act and replaced the cash and carry. So what he ended up doing is that he would lend or lease supplies or arms to any country whose defense was vital to the United States. And so basically what was happening with this is, if you're, the example is if your neighbor's house is on fire, you're going to lend them a hose. You don't want $15, you just want the hose back, because that's how you helped them, is by giving them the hose to help put the fire out. So we just wanted our stuff back when you were done with it. We didn't want cash because Great Britain didn't have any cash. So we realized you're strapped. We're going to help you with the goods. And so we're eventually going to pass this as Congress. And we ended up spending initially $7 billion, but all in all it was $50 billion under this particular act. So whatever goods they had were to be returned after the war. Now, to again keep our stake in neutrality, at this point, the Nazis and Hitler had fallen back on their treaty with the Soviets, and so we send Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets also, which is going to be pretty controversial in the United States because a lot of people were scared of communism and Stalin and all these things. So we're doing these things to try and protect our country. And in order for this to be successful, we had to be able to keep supply lines open across the Atlantic. So we had to fight against all of these hundreds of German submarines that had been put there to block shipping that was happening between the United States and Europe and between other European countries. And in April and May of 1941, the Germans ended up sinking 1.2 million tons of British goods. So they were sinking goods faster than the British could keep up with them. So it was a bad situation for us to try and be able to aid these ships or the boats. So we ended up sending more of our boats to help with the British boats, and Roosevelt gave the idea or the order to attack German U-boats only in self-defense. So we still weren't instigating anything, but ultimately this would lead us into direct conflict with the Germans. Now, while this is going on, we are setting up plans for war. We have a meeting that happens off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada on a ship between Winston Churchill and FDR, and they're getting together and talking about why the war is being fought and what kinds of things they were going to stick to if they partnered up to fight in this war together. They've both agreed to seek no territorial expansion, so they're not looking to expand their land. They would do no territorial changes without the consent of the inhabitants. They would respect the right of whatever people they came encounter with to choose their own government. So all of these things are the exact opposite of what Hitler's doing. Poland disappeared off the map. So obviously they're not considering the people that were there. They wanted to promote free trade among nations. They wanted to encourage international cooperation to improve lives, build secure peace based on freedom. They wanted to disarm the aggressors, but we tried to disarm the Germans once before, and that didn't go very well. And they wanted to establish a permanent system of general security. And so this document, this Atlantic Charter, became known as the Declaration by the United Nations. And they said, United Nations because 26 different countries signed it, including China and the Soviet Union. And so I don't remember the number, but a large number of people in the world supported this idea. And so it was kind of a slap in the face to the Germans. And then ultimately, what it ends up happening is in September of 1941, a U-boat fires on a German U-boat fires on our boat. Our Navy is ordered to fire at German ships and to sink on sight. Several ships go back and forth being sunk. 100 lives are lost of ours. But FDR still needed something more dramatic to get Congress to vote for war. They needed an overt act that would drive us into war. He didn't feel like them attacking our ships was overt enough. Unfortunately, the incident that occurs that pushes us to war is Pearl Harbor. So FDR gets his vote by Congress to declare war, but it comes in a much different fashion as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor. But again, these boat challenges are happening in August and September of 1941, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor is in December of 1941. So, while the attack on Pearl Harbor was unexpected unless you're a conspiracy theorist and think that FDR knew about the attack and wanted it to happen so he could go to war, which is a whole different conversation. But ultimately, we were on the road to prepare to go to war as a result of the trouble that we had with the Germans, and so we were in not as bad a situation as we could have been when Pearl Harbor happened. So, again, our goals was to talk about the response the United States that we had to the outbreak of war in Europe. So we maintain neutrality as long as possible. And we had the Cash and Carry and then Lend-Lease Act to show how Roosevelt assisted the Allies without declaring war. So we had the Cash and Carry and Lend-Lease Act. And then we also protected boats that were going back and forth to Great Britain, ultimately, which is going to drive us into conflict with the Germans because they were attacking our boats. And we said, please don't do that. And they did anyways. So this is what eventually drove us towards war. And then again, the bombing on Pearl Harbor is what sealed the deal. All right. Have a good day.